Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of your sources and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight to help you become truly well-informed. Today we're diving into a topic that is, well, absolutely crucial for respectful engagement with communities worldwide. Free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, is a concept that really compels us to reconsider how we interact, whether that's in science, business, or even creative writing. We've got a fantastic array of sources here, including guidelines for researchers from the University of Arizona's Native American Community Partnership Outreach, a pretty comprehensive handbook on free, prior, and informed consent from the UN Ramidi program, and also a truly thought-provoking article on Indigenous Stories and Non-Indigenous Writers by Ambeline Quamelina. Our mission today is to uncover not just what FPIC is, but, to understand its profound historical roots, and critically, to examine how this concept, born from centuries of disregarded rights, really pushes us to rethink genuine respect and self-determination. Okay, let's unpack this.
Indeed. And this deep dive, it's really about recognizing that FPIC isn't merely some legal term or bureaucratic hurdle. It's actually a fundamental human right. We'll connect the dots between historical injustices and the essential right of communities to self-determination. We'll offer you clear insights into how this concept plays out in, well, very real-world scenarios. By the end of our conversation, you'll understand why it's so much more than just, asking for permission.
That's a powerful framing. So at its core, free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah.
Okay, it sounds formal, but our sources show it's actually about something incredibly human and foundational,
Right.
the right to choose. What's the essence of FPIC, and why has it become such a significant sort of institutionalized right, particularly for Indigenous peoples?
You're right, the essence is choice, but it's absolutely crucial to understand this as a collective right, not just an individual one. It fundamentally stems from recognizing a group's full property rights over their ancestral lands and resources, and it's intrinsically linked to their right to self-determination. The UN RDD handbook highlights that while, the practice of asking permission has existed in many societies for a long time, it became formally institutionalized for Indigenous peoples because of their very distinct and, frankly, tragic history of displacement, dispossession, and the unconsented taking of their resources. I mean, for centuries, outsiders simply took. And this led to ongoing struggles to defend their lands, their cultures, their ways of life.
Right. So it's not a new concept of respect exactly, but a newly institutionalized right born from centuries of disregarded basic rules. That's a really critical distinction. The sources emphasize that Indigenous peoples' demand for FPIC is an affirmation of their prior rights as owners and custodians, effectively giving them veto power over projects. But I'm imagining a diverse community here. How does this collective right actually work in practice, especially when it comes to making decisions? Does it mean like 100% agreement, or is it more nuanced?
Oh, it's definitely nuanced. The process is inherently community-led. And it often reaches decisions by consensus, meaning, a majority agrees after a thorough discussion. This approach, it intentionally allows for diverse views to be heard, for internal conflicts to be resolved, and it ensures the decision truly reflects the community's collective will. And what's fascinating here is that it's very rarely just a one-time event. Because the effects of any activity, they're continuous, right? So the FPIC process ideally should be too. This empowers a community not only to make decisions, but also to amend them as circumstances evolve. It fosters a genuine, ongoing partnership.
That continuous engagement, that's a really important detail. Okay, let's break down those four key components because each word, free, prior, informed, and consent, carries significant weight. What exactly does free mean in FPIC, and what are some of the maybe less obvious ways that freedom can be undermined?
Right. Free means the decision and the entire process leading up to it must be completely free of any pressure, any intimidation, or manipulation from outside actors. This includes the obvious stuff, like overt threats, but also more subtle tactics. Things like linking essential developments, say, building a much-needed school or clinic to project approval.
Tying it together.
Exactly, or making lavish promises that kind of take advantage of a community's immediate needs. The UN RDD handbook, it explicitly calls out tactics like threats of arrest or even just the presence of military forces. It also highlights bribery and what's sometimes called divide and rule tactics.
Trying to split the community.
Precisely, trying to sow discord within a community. Those are clear violations. The community has to be free to decide at its own pace, respecting their own cultural protocols, their spiritual acts, without external deadlines dictating their internal processes. The key insight here, I think, is that true freedom often means acknowledging and actively working to rectify existing power imbalances.
So the freedom from any pressure, direct or subtle, is absolutely foundational. But I imagine achieving that freedom in practice, especially where these severe power imbalances exist, well, that must be incredibly challenging. Are there common subtle tactics that communities really need to watch out for? And that makes me think about how critical when a decision is made can be, which brings us straight to prior. What exactly does that entail, and why is the timing so absolutely crucial?
Yeah, prior means in advance. And it sounds simple, but it's profoundly important. The community must have the opportunity to form its opinion and make its decision before the proposed activity starts. And crucially, even before a final decision is made by the proponent to implement the project.
Before they're fully committed.
Exactly. Ideally, consultation should happen right at the very initial conceptual phase, when the project is still just an idea, not some pre-cooked plan presented as a done deal. The University of Arizona guidelines echo this very clearly. No research should begin until tribal clearance is obtained, full stop. And a critical aspect here is respecting the community's timeline. That could be days, weeks, or, even months. It depends on their traditional decision-making mechanisms, seasonal activities, maybe unexpected community events. The insight, really, is that rushing this phase can completely invalidate the entire process because it removes the genuine opportunity for the community to actually influence the outcome.
So not just before shovels hit the ground, but way before the blueprint is even finalized, and certainly before any external entity has fully committed resources or reputation. Wow. That's a huge shift from how many projects are typically initiated, isn't it?
It really is.
Okay. And then there's informed. This one seems like it might be the most straightforward, but I suspect it's actually more complex than just, handing over a document. What constitutes being truly informed in this context?
Oh, it is incredibly complex, and this is often where information asymmetry becomes a major challenge. Informed means the community receives all the necessary information to make a good decision, and importantly, in language and forms they truly understand. This goes way beyond just technical reports. It has to encompass the exact purpose, the duration, the precise locations of all related activities, including any new roads, support functions, things like that.
No knock-on effects.
Absolutely. The management structures, who exactly will be involved, even down to security personnel, and, crucially, how any benefits will be shared. The Arizona guidelines, for instance, they emphasize really crucial cultural considerations for biospecimens, things like storage, secondary uses, and the absolute need for signed written agreements outlining all these details. And critically, it also means providing clear information on potential negative impacts and risks, not just painting a rosy picture of the positives.
Not just the upside.
Exactly. The critical insight, I think, is that merely providing stacks of documents isn't enough. The burden is squarely on the proponent to ensure genuine understanding. That often requires long-term engagement, using multiple formats, translating materials, and actively addressing potential power imbalances that might make community members hesitant to ask clarifying questions. It's really about bridging knowledge gaps, not just dumping information.
That point about bridging knowledge gaps, not just dumping information,
Right.
That's incredibly powerful. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. The sources mention the need for independent impact assessments. Why is that so crucial? And what kinds of impacts are we talking about that might otherwise just get overlooked?
Yeah, the independence is key. Independent environmental, economic, social, and human rights impact assessments are absolutely critical, and they must be done prior to a decision, not as some kind of post hoc justification. The UN RDD handbook notes that proponents, often unintentionally perhaps, but frequently overlook profoundly important elements like cultural connections, sacred areas, or the very real social disruption caused by an influx of strangers or outside workers.
Things that aren't easily quantifiable.
Exactly. Things that don't show up on a standard balance sheet. For example, in American Indian and Alaska Native, or AIN research, the Arizona guidelines highlight these deep cultural values around things like the patenting of genes, cloning, the use of blood and tissues, things that can be entirely missed or misunderstood by external researchers if not explicitly addressed. Communities also must consider and be informed about risks like project bankruptcy, what happens then, or the long-term environmental damage from an unexpected disaster like an oil spill. How will these be dealt with and who bears the responsibility? The independence of these assessments is meant to ensure an unbiased view of all potential consequences, good and bad.
Okay. And finally, consent. This word feels like the absolute linchpin of FPIC. How is actual consent different from just mere consultation, which, let's be honest, often happens without true community buy-in?
This is the crucial distinction. You're absolutely right. Consent means the community's decision is acknowledged and critically respected. This includes their explicit right to veto a project, to say no. Consultation, on the other hand, often implies the community's views are noted, may be heard, but then they can be, and frankly often are, disregarded if they don't align with the proponent's agenda.
So consultation can be performative.
It can be, yes. The UNRDD handbook stresses that FPIC inherently includes the right to say no or to demand significant amendments to a proposal. It's fundamentally about empowering the community's sovereign decision, whether that ends up being an agreement, maybe a conditional acceptance with very specific terms, or a total rejection. It's the difference, really, between being a stakeholder whose opinion is considered and being a rights holder whose decision is binding.
That distinction between stakeholder and rights holder. Wow, that perfectly encapsulates the shift FPIC demands. Now, let's dive into those guidelines for researchers. It's clear there's a specific urgent need for FPIC when engaging with American Indian and Alaska Native AIN communities. You mentioned earlier that often both tribal and institution-based review, like through an institutional review board or IRB, are required. What does this source tell us about their unique status and the historical context that makes FPIC so incredibly vital in research?
Right. It's essential to understand that the 503 federally recognized AIN tribes in the U.S., including 22 in Arizona alone, are sovereign nations. This inherent sovereignty grants them the ability to protect their cultures, their traditions, and, critically, the fundamental right to approve or disapprove proposed research within their communities or involving their people. This isn't just a courtesy, it's a matter of national self-determination. No research should even begin without tribal clearance. And as you mentioned, this often means researchers need to navigate both tribal review processes and their own institutional IRBs.
And tragically, our sources provide some really stark examples of why this level of protection is so desperately needed. The history of research involving Indigenous communities is, unfortunately, pretty riddled with abuses. Can you share some of those powerful examples that really underscore the importance of respectful, consented research?
Absolutely. The guidelines for researchers cites two cases that will powerfully illustrate the profound violations of trust that have occurred and why FPIC is so critical in this space. The first is the Havasupai Diabetes Project, which started back in 1989. Arizona State University researchers partnered with the Havasupai tribe, ostensibly to study links between genes and the high rates of diabetes in the community.
Okay, seemed collaborative at first.
Exactly. However, without the tribe's knowledge or their specific informed consent, the researchers later used the collected blood samples for a whole host of unrelated studies, including research into schizophrenia, migration patterns, even inbreeding.
Wow. Completely different uses.
Completely different. And a Havasupai member tragically discovered this misuse years later in 2003. It revealed a profound violation of trust and consent, particularly around the secondary use of sensitive biological data. And the ripple effect of this specific breach of trust, well, it created a lasting reluctance among the Havasupai and many other Indigenous communities to engage with external researchers at all. It really underscores the long-term damage that these violations cause.
Just devastating.
It is. The second example mentioned is the hantavirus outbreak in 1993. During a serious outbreak on the Navajo Nation, the tribal community made requests for privacy regarding infected individuals and specific locations, out of respect and concern. But these requests were widely violated by major media outlets, leading to further harm, stigmatization for the community. It demonstrates how basic human rights and dignity can just be trampled when respect and consent are absent, even in the context of a public health crisis.
Those are truly heartbreaking cautionary tales, reminders of what happens when consent is violated and that sacred trust is shattered. So what mechanisms are actually in place now to try and prevent such abuses in research? And what makes them genuinely effective in upholding these FPIC principles?
Well, beyond the standard institutional IRBs at universities, tribal communities are increasingly establishing their own independent tribal IRBs. And the source notes something really important. Tribal IRBs do not usually defer to university IRBs.
Asserting sovereignty.
Exactly. It's a powerful assertion of their sovereignty and their control over research conducted on their lands or involving their people. These tribal IRBs, they focus intently on elements like ensuring the research is genuinely understood by community members, that the consent process fully informs and freely consents participants, and that potential harms are minimized critically, considering cultural, spiritual, and social impacts right alongside any purely medical or scientific ones. The guidelines we looked at provide a really comprehensive checklist for researchers. It covers everything from how personal information is protected, who actually owns the data long-term, how results are reported back to the community, and crucially, whether those results are framed through a resilience lens, focusing on strengths rather than a deficit lens which can pathologize communities. The goal is ensuring the community actually benefits from the research and isn't just, studied.
That focus on resilience and benefit sharing is key. Now, it's clear that FPIC extends far beyond just scientific studies. Amble and Quay Molina's article, Indigenous Stories and Non-Indigenous Writers, makes a strong, really compelling case for its application in cultural and creative works, too. And here's where it gets really interesting for a broader audience, I think, as it touches on how we consume and share stories, culture, heritage.
Absolutely. This article highlights a critical extension of FPIC, its role in safeguarding Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, which is, inextricably linked to their identity and heritage. It points out that traditionally, non-Indigenous writers often retold Indigenous narratives without FPIC, without any real consent, and certainly without any sharing of copyright or benefits with the Indigenous knowledge holders whose stories they were using.
Basically appropriation.
Yes, essentially appropriation. And this historical pattern led directly to the establishment of Indigenous publishers, like Magabala Books in Australia, specifically created to ensure Indigenous control over their own stories and their equitable dissemination.
The article even mentions a fairly high-profile example that caused a lot of distress quite recently, showing this isn't just some abstract historical concept.
It does, yes. It specifically acknowledges the concerns raised by Indigenous voices from North America regarding author J.K. Rowling's story, which inappropriately incorporated aspects of their specific cultures and spiritual beliefs without consent or, it seems, deep understanding. This really underscores the very real harm caused by cultural appropriation when FPIC is ignored. It leads to feelings of theft, misrepresentation, and a diminishment of living, breathing cultural traditions. It's a powerful reminder that stories aren't just entertainment. They carry profound cultural significance and weight.
Absolutely. So moving beyond appropriation toward genuine collaboration, what does equitable partnership actually look like in this context when cultural stories are shared or adapted? What are the practical steps involved?
Well, for a partnership to be truly equitable, the article argues it necessitates the sharing of royalties and copyright. That's fundamental. It gives the example of Jandamara and the Bonuba resistance, where copyright and royalties were shared between the non-Indigenous historian Howard Peterson and Bonuba man Banjo Warren Murrah. That stands as a positive model. The article also notes, very importantly, that for some stories, the copyright should remain entirely with the Indigenous person or people. And that decision must be made freely prior to the project starting and with full information about all the implications.
So the Indigenous creators retain full control if they choose.
Exactly. Furthermore, even when non-Indigenous creators engage Indigenous advisors or, say, beta readers, those individuals should be properly compensated for their expertise, for their cultural and intellectual labor, and their potential contribution as co-authors, with a rightful share in copyright and royalties, must be carefully considered, especially when their cultural input is significant or foundational to the work. It's really about recognizing intellectual labor and cultural ownership, not just seeking some free advice or a stamp of approval.
That makes so much sense. I can see how vital this is. The article mentions that Indigenous cultures often have their own specific internal rules about who can tell certain stories, how they can be told, and when. It's not just about intellectual property in a Western legal sense, is it? It feels much, much deeper than that.
Oh, it's profoundly deeper. The author argues quite powerfully that given the massive historical and ongoing power imbalance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, any notion of a truly equitable cultural exchange is difficult, maybe even impossible, without adhering strictly to FPIC principles. The appropriation of Indigenous cultures and stories, she argues, causes real harm to real people, especially given the centuries of marginalization and, frankly, sustained efforts to destroy these living traditions. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDAP, explicitly affirms their rights to their cultures, their heritage, their traditional knowledge, and their languages. You see this in Articles 11, 12, and 13. This reinforces the fundamental need for FPIC in this domain, too. It's about respecting a culture's right to self-determination over its own narratives, not just its land or resources.
It's disheartening, but unfortunately our sources do acknowledge that sometimes, despite all the guidelines and principles we've discussed, FPIC is violated or simply ignored by powerful entities. When communities find their rights aren't respected, what can they actually do? What strategies does the UN RDD Handbook suggest for community empowerment and enforcement in those situations?
Yeah, the UN RDD Handbook dedicates a really powerful section to community empowerment. It emphasizes that Indigenous strength often lies in unity and organization. Communities must have alternative plans ready, and they need to be prepared to enforce their decisions through a variety of proactive and sometimes reactive measures. It's about building resilience and having strategies for organized resistance when necessary.
Okay, so what are some of those measures? What kinds of actions have proven effective in cases where FPIC has been disregarded?
Well, they range quite widely. They include direct legal actions like bringing companies or government entities to court for breaches of contract, environmental damage, or human rights violations. They also include launching strategic campaigns, often using media support to inform a wider national and international public about what's happening. Public pressure can be very effective.
Using the court of public opinion.
Exactly. Networking with other Indigenous organizations and their supporters globally is also vital. Forming strong advocacy groups to engage with national governments and international forums like various United Nations bodies or regional intergovernmental organizations, these are all important strategies. And critically, something proactive, developing community protocols. These are documents created by the community itself to proactively govern the entry and conduct of projects, external researchers, or creators. This empowers them to set the terms from the very beginning. The core idea running through all of this is to remain organized, united, and ensure everyone in the community is kept fully informed of developments and understands their collective strategy.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? This deep dive into free, prior, and informed consent reveals a principle that, well, it goes far beyond just a simple checkbox or some kind of procedural formality. It's truly a cornerstone of respect, of self-determination, and ultimately of justice. Whether we're talking about groundbreaking medical research, the development of natural resources on ancestral lands, or the sensitive sharing of cultural narratives.
Yeah, understanding FPIC means recognizing the inherent rights of communities to control their own destiny and protect their unique heritage, their knowledge, their future. It really challenges all of us, researchers, companies, creators, governments, individuals, to move beyond mere consultation, which can be superficial, towards genuine, power-balanced partnership. A partnership where consent is freely given, fully prior to any action being taken, and based on complete and understandable information. And importantly, not just once, but potentially revisited throughout the life of a project or collaboration.
So what stands out to you after hearing about the detailed history and the specific applications of FPIC? Think about the Havasupai Diabetes Project, the discussions around cultural storytelling, the critical importance of those independent impact assessments. Consider how these principles of genuine respect, proactive engagement, and true informed consent might apply to the interactions you have in your own life and work. And maybe reflect on how upholding them can build stronger, more equitable relationships in absolutely any domain.